been visiting and sharing your reflections from this morning. We are now going to turn this part of the lunch over to our keynote speaker, and I have the pleasure of introducing him. So our keynote speaker today is Eric Schwartz. He is president of Refugee International. He has been president of Refugees International since 2017. Before that, he was dean of the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, Humphrey School for Public Affairs, which I've never told you. I almost got a job there many years ago. I was the top two candidates, but didn't get the offer. So we might have met there, actually, if life had been different. In 2009 to 2011, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration during the Obama administration. He has had a number of other jobs. He has been senior human rights the senior human rights and humanitarian official at the National Security Council. During the Clinton administration, he's had many other positions at the UN, years ago at the House of Representatives for the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs. Really, truly, I didn't see his CV or his resume, but if I had, I know it's a good 20-page read, if not more. And all of these experiences, all of this capacity has been really based on deep educational human capital that he acquired years ago. He has a law degree from NYU. He has a master's in public affairs from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. And then, like me, years ago, went to SUNY. He has a BA, I believe it's a BA, right? Not a BS, from SUNY at Binghamton. So, yes, it's at least a 20-page read if you were to read his CV. And you could go online and read the blurbs about him. You can also read what he's written online. There's extensive material online. But what does his entire list of accomplishments leave out? It leaves out his passion and his commitment to refugees, asylum seekers, and humanitarian issues more broadly. And I think you're going to see and hear some of that now during the keynote. He has that passion, and I didn't know Eric until the last 2 years or so. So it's not like we go way back. But in what I've read from what you've written, from what I've seen online, that passion and commitment to humanitarian issues hasn't wavered throughout his career, and it underlies what I think we're going to hear about, which is his unfettered optimism about the future for refugees and asylum seekers. I might be over-speaking there, but we'll see. It's a bit fettered, kind of unfettered, somewhere on the fettered spectrum. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Eric Schwartz to the podium.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very generous introduction. My resume is not 20 pages, although having been in academia, I realized that it should have been, but it wasn't. And many thanks for joining us. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to participate in your activities today, but the program sounds really fascinating. It's a pleasure to discuss the human rights of refugees and other forced migrants with the subtitle of these remarks, Confessions of a Humanitarian Optimist. And It is with some trepidation that I offer remarks to a group of attendees, so many of whom are deeply involved in the work of refugee protection, whether that's litigation on behalf of asylum seekers, advocacy with policymakers, engagement with the public, research and writing to advance critical knowledge and understanding in the field. And before I get to the subject of my remarks, which I hope will be affirming and not depressing, I think it's important to state very clearly the challenges that are in front of us as we think about promotion of the rights and well-being of refugees and others who are forcibly displaced from their homes due to persecution, violence, human rights violations, and disasters that are born by natural hazards and often exacerbated by the impact of climate change. As most of you certainly know, at this moment in history, more than 70 million people around the world have fled their homes due to persecution, violence, human rights abuses. More than 25 million are refugees. More than 40 million others have fled within the borders of their countries of origin. And beyond those numbers, as we know, there are millions of people displaced each year by disasters from natural hazards, earthquakes, hurricanes, storm surges. The war in Syria has displaced millions, both internally and beyond the borders of that country. Misrule and deprivation has displaced millions of Venezuelans throughout the countries of South America. A brutal attack on the Rohingya Muslims in Western Burma, affected by crimes against humanity perpetrated by the military of Burma, resulted in massive forced migration, in addition to the killing of many, many thousands, massive forced migration of some 700 Rohingya into Bangladesh, bringing the total number of Rohingya in that country to around 1 million. These forced migrations have come on top of older and protracted situations of displacement involving Afghans in places like Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey, South Sudanese and Uganda, and in other neighboring countries, and many other populations around the world. And much closer to home, misery and despair resulting from the gravest fears of persecution and violence has caused hundreds of thousands in recent years to flee countries of Central America in search of freedom from fear. So, where are we today in the response? Unfortunately, at a moment in history when people of the world would most benefit by elevated political dialogue on global forced migration informed by evidence, as well as by policies that seek to reconcile or actually vindicate both the need for migration management and more than a modicum of humanity. We are confronted with policies that are informed by nativism and a rejection of the biblical admonition to welcome the stranger. In Europe, governments have closed borders to asylum seekers. For instance, in the case of Libya, have gone so far as to enter into arrangements in which they are complicit in the return of asylum seekers to situations threatening their lives and their freedom. In recent weeks, the government of Turkey has perpetrated a campaign in northern Syria that is causing displacement of many tens of something like 200,000, with Turkey's president suggesting a massive and ultimately forced and illegal relocation of 1 million Syrian refugees into a region from which Kurds are being ethnically cleansed. In the United States, I don't need to tell this group that we have witnessed a parade of horribles that reflect unmitigated hostility by the current administration toward asylum seekers. These have included unprecedented reductions in the U.S. refugee admissions program, and efforts effectively to end asylum for vulnerable Central Americans and return them to situations of grave risk. You say, where's the optimism, right? It's coming. With respect to overseas humanitarian engagement, President Trump has proposed each year massive cuts in assistance and has failed to speak out against horrendous abuses giving rise to massive refugee flight, such as large-scale killings and flight of Rohingya to Bangladesh. In fact, the President of the United States has not uttered a single public word about these crimes against humanity, among the most grave of our generation. The President has made clear in places like northeast Syria that protection of vulnerable communities like the Kurds are of little interest to his administration, and he has, in addition, withdrawn from key multilateral initiatives relating to migration and refugees. Perhaps most disturbing has been the hateful and evidence-free rhetoric and the demonization of forced migrants and asylum seekers by the political leadership in our country, the President. And of course, what makes this all the more upsetting is the fact that the consensus in the United States and in other parts of the world on behalf of principles of inclusion has always been a fragile one. And that at key points in our history, we've really relied on leadership to promote those principles, leadership that is now so terribly wanting. So, that's the bad news. But the bad news shouldn't prevent us from being reminded and reminding ourselves and being fortified by the most compelling principle, to my mind, that animates the work of advocates for refugees, for forced migrants, for humanitarian assistance, and for protection. And that's the principle of humanity. The notion that the suffering of one person, a Rohingya refugee child, threatened with malnutrition or sexual violence in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, is intrinsically, that suffering is intrinsically no less significant, no less compelling, no less worthy of compassion and response than if that suffering child was your own or my own child. We can, I suppose, and we should, and I have, made many arguments based on refugee contributions to economic growth, on the value of refugee assistance and protection in a national security strategy, and for promoting U.S. leadership around the world. But for me, and I believe for most of the American public and publics around the world, it is this principle of humanity that is so critical, because it provides for us the moral foundation of our work, and because it inspires us, advocates, policymakers, citizens who elect policymakers, to promote practices and policies that recognize that there, but for the grace of God or fate, go all of us. So why, despite all the nasty and vicious, gratuitously cruel policies coming from Washington, the terrible ways that Washington's assault on asylum, on refugee protection, on refugee resettlement is enabling terrible behavior among other governments around the world? Why are there reasons to persevere and to be encouraged? First, I think it's very important to come to these challenges with a sense of perspective and to take a long view, and to appreciate that nativism, chauvinism, bullying of migrants and others who are vulnerable is not new to our political culture or around the world. Here in the United States, there is, of course, our original sin of slavery, but there has been so much more. In the 19th century, there were know-nothing appeals to anti-immigrant sentiment. In the early part of the 20th century, There were the anti-Semitic rants of demagogues like Charles Edward Coughlin, who reportedly had tens of millions of followers. There was, of course, the trafficking in innuendo and guilt by association of Senator Joe McCarthy during the 1950s. In short, there have always been loud voices of intolerance appealing to our fears rather than our hopes and our aspirations, ready to blame the other in pursuit of political power. So these challenges, really, they're never conclusively won. There is no end of history for vindication of human rights and the triumph of justice over inequality. Rather, there is the critical importance of perseverance, of engagement, of a willingness to stay the course. And even in these difficult times, there are more than simply glimmers of hope for those who care deeply about promoting a brighter future for tens of millions of people each year who are displaced. We can be inspired by the strength and the willingness of those forced from their home to endure suffering and to persevere. The Rohingya woman, her name was Laila, whom I met in Bangladesh, who saw soldiers torture a village and shoot people attempting to flee, who escaped with her 3 young daughters as her husband told her he would meet them in Bangladesh, who learned later that her husband was shot and killed, and who was determined to tell her story, was determined to tell her story so the world could know, and determined to make a life for herself and for her children. We can be inspired by people like the Colombians I met last year in and outside of Cúcuta, near the Venezuelan border, who were welcoming the strangers, providing assistance to so-called caminantes, the walkers who were in many cases traveling hundreds of miles from the border to Bogota. We can be inspired by these and countless other stories of endurance and the willingness to sustain hope of those whose lives have been so dramatically affected. We can be encouraged that while forced migration around the world is certainly an overwhelming burden for millions of affected people, it is really a manageable global public policy challenge. Refugees and others forcibly displaced by conflict, persecution, and human rights make up a tiny percent of the world's population, and the $27 billion or so spent on humanitarian assistance each year is really minuscule. In other words, while the bad news may be that governments are not doing enough to address humanitarian needs, we know that with greater political will, these challenges are quite surmountable. We can be encouraged that despite annual calls by the current presidential administration for massive reductions in U.S. humanitarian assistance around the world and refugee assistance, the Congress has sustained generous levels of international humanitarian assistance from Africa to Asia to the Middle East and beyond. We can be encouraged, but we can't be complacent, and we must do more, such as continue efforts, for example, to undo the elimination of support for the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, which provides critical assistance to women and girls. We can be encouraged that despite the hateful rhetoric around migration and forced migration, the vast majority of governments last year endorsed a global compact on migration, a kind of rights-based desideratum, which recognizes, I always like to get a little Latin into every speech, which recognizes that individuals forced from their homes for a broad array of reasons are deserving of basic protections. We can be encouraged, but we can't be complacent, as calls to action, including, for example, a call on governments to respond to climate-induced forced migrants. Calls to action must be followed by real policy measures that define those responses. In this respect, we can also be encouraged by legislative proposals in the Senate and the House for a program of resettlement for those impacted by climate change. We can be encouraged that international organizations and governments have begun, however tentatively, to recognize that the world's refugees, should not be warehoused pending political solutions in their countries that are uncertain at best and unlikely at worst, but rather that such people deserve access to education, employment, and the ability to develop themselves and their families in their places of refuge. We can be encouraged that governments from Uganda to Jordan to Ethiopia to Colombia have sought, however unevenly and in varying degrees, to realize those objectives. And as a result, South Sudanese refugees, Syrian refugees, Venezuelan refugees, and others in countries of refuge are better off. But we can't be complacent, as the protection records of each of these governments is far from perfect. Whether it is corruption that impacted the program in Uganda, restrictions on the right to work, and border restrictions in Jordan, failure to consider the needs of internally displaced persons in Ethiopia, or practices in Colombia that are lagging behind policy pronouncements about inclusion of Venezuelans. We can be encouraged that lawyers in the United States and around the world remain really on the front lines right now of efforts to ensure basic protections for asylum seekers and refugees. But we can't be complacent, as the demands for legal representation and legal advocacy have dramatically outstripped current supply, and law firms and private philanthropy must do much more. We can be encouraged by new and innovative ways that advocates are using to engage the public debate with positive and compelling messages about the contributions of refugees and immigrants. But here again, work has just begun. And while there is no shortage of survey data demonstrating that majorities of Americans in some way, shape, manner, or form do wish to welcome the stranger, advocates have as yet not succeeded in making support for refugees a winning proposition in our political culture. And finally, we can be encouraged that so many of you remain committed to use your talents and skills to sustain these and related efforts. So, in closing, I don't mean to be Pollyanna-ish, which is a word, without making this a partisan speech, I do know there are so many limitations to progress without a dramatic change in our country's politics and the politics around the world. But none of that should diminish our appreciation of the value and the impact of these and other continued efforts to create the prospects for a brighter future for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Thank you. I'm taking questions? All right, I'm taking questions. Questions? Yes, in the back.
So thank you so much. I would like to ask, what do you think the future of the United States policy concerning that critical issue, which is the refugees, would be, especially at the level of the southern border?
Well, I think there's no question that in this administration, we know what the policy measures are going to be. President Trump has indicated in so many different ways that without really knowing that there is a refugee convention and protocol, that he fundamentally rejects the values and the obligations that that document imposes upon states, and imposes, and not only that document, but also our own domestic law, our own implementing legislation. So the future in the current administration is, I'm not reading any tea leaves. I'm basically repeating what the president has said. Don't come. And if you try to come, we're not going to let you come. And he has matched that rhetoric, or his administration has matched that rhetoric with sort of an unmatched array of policies and practices that few of us would have ever dreamt an administration official would ever try to implement. And I can run through them, but I think most of you know what most of those policies and practices are. I mean, whether it's the Remain in Mexico policy, whether it's the criminalization of border crossing, whether it's these grotesque safe third country agreements that are not only grotesque, but they're also malicious and mischievous, because they turn the whole concept of a safe third country agreement on their heads. So we could talk about those, but it's one thing after another. And so in this administration, I don't think there's any expectation. And what is interesting about this administration is, for many years, for decades, the human rights community's single, I think, most significant achievement was to socialize norms of human rights. That didn't mean that that governments around the world all respected human rights, but it did mean that governments that didn't respect human rights were on the defensive, and they at least had to give lip service to the fact that they do respect those rights, and it provided advocates with a tool, the tool of shame, reporting, report cards, you name it. Those were the tools of the advocacy community. But when you have an administration that fundamentally rejects the basic principles underlying human rights and the human rights movement, that tool of advocacy becomes far less effective. In fact, it becomes kind of ineffective. Now, don't get me wrong, we still use it because there are still people in the administration who feel an obligation to talk about this, or have some legal obligations to talk about it. So when they announce they're going to do 18,000 refugees, they say, well, one of the real reasons we're going to only permit resettlement of 18,000 refugees next year is because we think our fundamental obligation is to asylum, so we're going to have to deploy our resources to asylum, right? So, but then at least you can call that out and explain why that's bullshit, right? Pardon my language. But in that situation, so there's we can still do some calling out, but by and large, that tool of advocacy has largely been denied because, they don't care about refugees, and they say so. I've been riffing on this because the tougher question is, what about a different administration, Democratic or Republican? I think any new administration, whether it's a William Weld administration or a Joe Biden administration, will move in a very different direction. Not that, that we were imperfect exemplars even under great assistant secretaries of state for refugees, one of whom is sitting to my left. We were imperfect exemplars of refugee protection principles, throughout our history. But at least we aspired to those objectives, right? And if there was serious abuses going on of refugee rights anywhere around the world, American diplomats were engaged, right? Or we had more than a modicum of shame about brutal policies on the border. So it's not like the Obama administration treated border crossers with kid gloves, but they were aware of the scrutiny and the person who ran that area of government for Obama used to be a senior official at the National Council of La Raza, right? And so that had, so we can expect in a different administration, Democrat or Republican, I work for a nonpartisan organization, that there will be efforts to move away. What I'm worried about, and I think this is important for the advocacy community, is we shouldn't underestimate we should not underestimate the political challenges that a new administration will face in undoing things like remain in Mexico, like safe third country agreements. There will be all kinds of voices, especially on the security side. I know, because I had the same situation when I came in to the Clinton administration, you know, on Haiti policy, right? There will be all these voices within the administration and within the body politic that says, you know, maybe some of these things are still valuable tools that we should maintain. So we can't underestimate the challenge of reversing some of the terrible policies that this administration has imposed.
Yep. So thank you again for your presentation. So my question is, for organizations like yours, it seems that you're caught in this difficult place where on the one hand, you have to sort of talk about the urgency and the emergency because you need funding and you need attention, and we need that, right, to be able to call our attention to this. But on the other, by using that narrative, we can fall into the trap of going into the moral panic and immigrants are coming and waves and crisis. So I wonder how you navigate that tension between presenting the sense of urgency and emergency, but actually making sure that people understand that it's not what another narrative are presenting out there about the nature of refugees and forcibly displaced people.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that I tried to get at that issue a little bit in my comments when I said that, you know, this is a very manageable problem, challenge. Maybe I was overstating it a little bit, but I think Beth and I were at a meeting where people were talking about, stop saying this is the highest number of people displaced since World War II, because in the course of global history, this ain't so bad. And I think, you know, I think we have to be cognizant of that reality, and also cognizant of the fact that if you speak in apocalyptic terms, people are going to get frightened. But I would also make a distinction between saying that something represents a humanitarian imperative and in some respects reflects a humanitarian crisis, and saying that this is a national security crisis. There are different kinds of crises, and we have to figure out ways to make distinctions that the public can understand and appreciate. Hi.
While your argument for the historical analysis is very revitalizing in seeing that these problems of nativism and chauvinism are nothing new, and that there's ultimately been people who have propagated the message of hope, I think it's important to realize that while this overarching hope has existed, the problem is still iterative and present in our society today. So what is going to break the cycle of the nativism and chauvinism and the barriers to entry, and kind of build upon and expound upon this hope that people have?
All right. In other words, it's nice to be philosophical about these things, but what are you going to do? And I think that's a very reasonable question. I do think it's a challenge, because I think that these issues, for whatever reason, are very susceptible to the stoking of fear, right? There are some issues where presumably it's more difficult to stoke fear. Not so much with these issues, because, I guess human beings have apprehension about those who look different and those who, and so stoking fear, especially in the context of 9/11 and the security challenges that we, the United States, and other governments have confronted. So it is a big challenge. It's not easy. And what makes it more difficult is it's precisely the kind of challenge that we would have a better capacity to address if the messaging from our political leaders was designed to address those, right? And so, yeah, we're kind of in this perfect storm of a bad situation. So what is the political strategy out of it, both in terms of people who focus on refugee rights, as well as people who focus on politics. And since this really isn't a conversation about politics, I'll stick more to, I mean, it is about politics. This is all politics, but partisan politics. I'll stick to the latter. But I will say about the former, the politics, is I think that, I think, again, not a partisan statement, but I think that, I think it was noteworthy that despite the rhetoric and the nativism and none of that went away in the 2018 elections, midterm elections, but they don't seem to have had a dramatic effect on what people decided to do at the ballot box. So I can be, you can be mildly encouraged about that. But in terms of, how do you change the narrative in a compelling way? I mean, my organization is working on that right now. We have a brand new program focused on strategic outreach. We're collaborating with other non-governmental organizations, and it's a combination of political efforts, not partisan efforts. In fact, political efforts to reach across the aisle to look at, to find unlikely partners and constituencies in the business community, among Republicans, because, Republican members of Congress have been pretty unified in their staunch opposition to the U.S. refugee resettlement program since September of 2015 or thereabouts, right? Before that, it was a strong bipartisan consensus on behalf of refugee resettlement. So the campaign efforts in which that we're involved in and others involved in are really focusing on both sides of the political aisle, constituencies, Republican and Democratic, but Republican constituencies that, where there is sympathy at the states. Look at what the governor of Utah, I believe, just made a declaration saying that his state will accept refugees, right? So it's engagement with across political boundaries. It's also better mobilization of the sympathetic constituencies which just haven't been involved in these issues. And those efforts are going on. They have, as I said in my remarks, they have yet to be, I think, successful, but I think they're critically important.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for coming to speak. I'm just kind of curious how refugee advocates like yourself proactively plan for the estimated 140 million plus people that are expected to be displaced by climate change by 2050.
Well, we're fortunate at Refugees International because one of my predecessors, Ken Bacon, who was a former press spokesman at the Department of Defense, and tragically passed away in 2009. Prior to his passing, he, in recognition of this challenge, provided a gift to Refugees International and in coordination and with the support of other large donors, established, I think, one of the first, if not the first, climate displacement program supported by a non-governmental organization. And so we've had a program in climate displacement for 10 years, for over 10 years. And so I think the best way I can answer your question is to describe some of the issues that we focus on. First, we focus on making elite communities aware of this challenge, right? And so in the context of, for example, the Global Compact on Migration, our climate displacement manager at the time, her name is Alice Thomas, worked very hard to inject statements, expressions of concern on climate displacement into the Global Compact on Migration. Now, that language isn't binding, but that language is very helpful when you're a U.S. senator and you're thinking about legislation to provide resettlement for climate refugees, right? Or when you're in an international organization and you're questioning whether enough resources are being focused on disaster risk reduction, which is kind of the flip side or very similar to the whole area and field of climate adaptation, right? We're really kind of talking about two sides of the same coin. We've done a lot of reporting, country reporting on natural disasters in circumstances where those disasters, the impact of those disasters have been exacerbated over time by the impact of climate change, and focused on critically important issues of building resilience and ensuring that disaster risk reduction and adaptation principles are included in legislation, such as in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, to ensure that those kinds of improvements, are informed, or reconstruction is informed by principles of adaptation and risk reduction. The other thing that we do as an organization, I think, is we're not involved in mitigation, obviously, not directly involved in mitigation efforts, but I think by our reporting, by the reporting that we do, and I think the reporting that others do, you kind of play the role of, I would say canary in the coal mine, but you're not a canary. It's quite, you're trying to, be very public in your advocacy, but by demonstrating the effects of global warming over time on displacement, I like to think that has some impact on discussions surrounding mitigation.